To get started, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate Chevron sponsoring this as a Chevron forum, and I want to recognize my friend Heather Culp for being here. Thanks for being here, Heather, and thanks for your partnership. I'm very grateful for our relationship with Chevron. The conversation we're going to be having today is what lessons can be learned from Power Africa. We're doing this in partnership with the CSIS Energy Program and the CSIS Africa Program. I want to particularly thank my colleagues, Jen Cook and Sarah Ladislaw. Jen is double booked and chose to be with us, so thank you. She got a lot of options, and she chose to be with us today. I'm grateful. I think that providing energy to Africa was both a congressional idea and an Obama administration idea in terms of being better, more strategic about how the United States engaged in providing power and energy to Africa. And it's a great idea. We shouldn't get rid of it. I'd say half my job at a think tank like CSIS is to stop stupid things from happening. I consider it colossally stupid if we stopped doing the Power Africa thing. I don't think it's necessarily on the table, but I consider it a very dumb thing given the world that we're in today. So I don't think the question should be, should we keep it, though I think that may be a question we need to at least answer the answer that resoundingly is yes. Are there some improvements to it? I think there probably are, and I think we'll be able to tease some of that out. Is this replicable across other regions? I think and hope so. And could we apply this to other things like IT or water? I think we should consider that as well. So I think this was one of the I've been saying in the earlier session that this was an innovation of the Obama administration, and I think certainly the Obama administration, there are many great people in the Obama administration who championed this and made this happen, but there are also some really great leaders, both staffers and members of Congress, including Ed Royce and some of his staffers, who also championed this in the Congress. So this is both a bipartisan and a parts of government approach, and I think that there's a lot that we can learn and take from this, and I'd like to see it put on steroids, frankly. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague Jen Cook, and I want to thank again Jen and Sarah for their partnership in making this all happen. Jen, please come on up.
Thanks, Dan, and it really is a pleasure to be here. Having watched Power Africa be launched, watching it over the years, so I'm delighted to be here to kind of talk about progress and kind of the way forward. Look, Power Africa came about at a moment when African economies were growing. There was a moment of global recognition how important the power sector was, from U.S. businesses looking to do business in Africa, from African governments, from Africa private sector players. But all of this came about as kind of new opportunities were emerging. And people really recognized that one of the greatest blocks to economic transformation, to eventually getting more U.S. investors engaged, was the lack of access to affordable power. And so Power Africa kind of came on a wave of recognition, and I give a great credit to the Obama administration, but very much like the PEPFAR program before it, it kind of came on a wave of bipartisan push and support. And so Congressman Royce, Senator Coons, really powerful champions within the U.S. Congress to help make it possible, and I think that bipartisan support for the initiative was really important. It's also really important that it was kind of enshrined and institutionalized through the Electrify Africa Act, and I think that gives its legs well beyond any particular administration. So in terms of the model and whether it's replicable, first of all, what Power Africa did was kind of define the problem, measure the problem, bring data and understanding to the problem, and then say, okay, which tools are we going to use to bring to this issue? Very much, somewhat different from other kinds of development programs where we say, okay, we have this tool and we're going to we're going to do this. It really is a much more nimble and flexible approach, and whether we replicate Power Africa in some other way or in some other sector or area, I think that idea of having flexible, nimble development tools that we can bring to the table is absolutely critical. It also elevated, I think in an important way, different institutions in the development agenda. And OPIC, I think of as the one, as the critical one that really, to my mind, is something of a bridge between the old way of doing development and I think what the future of development is going to look like, which is leveraging others to bear upon certain problems. It's also interesting, I think, in Power Africa, how in a number of cases, it's really helped complement and amplify other development initiatives. I was in Senegal recently, and you look at how Feed the Future and MCC and now Power Africa kind of blend to helping transform kind of the rice corridor in Senegal in a way that any one of those initiatives individually could not have done. And so looking for ways to blend those strands of development assistance and investment, I think, are very important. The problem, though, and I think this is kind of the challenge of Power Africa, I mean, there's a reason that African power sectors have lagged behind even other developing countries. These are weak governments, traditionally, following independence. They have not had kind of the technocratic or manpower capacity to mount what are extremely complex infrastructure programs that require kind of a centralized, strong state and the cadres of planners and implementers to make it happen. You look at a place like Nigeria, which has 200 million people, produces 4,000 megawatts of electricity, versus its neighbor Cote d'Ivoire that has really focused on this in a very important way, that now produces 2,000 megawatts of power in a country of only 24 million. So governance and kind of getting the sector right is critically important. And I think those are kind of my concerns for Power Africa, or let's say the challenges I think that Power Africa will need to overcome to be successful. Just like with PEPFAR, what is most easily measurable gets the most attention. And I think for Power Africa, kind of that megawatt generation has been the number one, not the number one goal, but the most prominent and the most evident, the most easily measurable. So kind of that golden ring of megawatt generation, while all the others, whether it's distribution or transmission and so forth, they're a little harder to measure, so it's a little fuzzy. And so that big megawatt generation gets the bulk of the attention. And I think we'll hear today how important the distribution, the transmission aspects are of it. And then that brings me to the second one, which is the focus on kind of transactions, bringing deals to close. Absolutely critical, and a number of these governments need kind of the help they can, all the help they can get to do that. But transactions and transactions and transactions don't necessarily add up to a transformation of the sector in a sustainable way. And so I think one of the challenges that Power Africa has is how do you kind of incentivize and push for the hard political choices that are often needed to build a sustainable, self-sustaining power sector. So those are my big concerns. To Dan's question, absolutely, it should not be canceled. I think it needs to be expanded. There are elements of it that I think can be applied, and the principles of Power Africa to many other sectors. I turn over to my colleague Sarah Ladislaw in the energy program. I'm really looking forward to the discussions today. So thanks, Dan, and thank you all.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, and especially for being in this room, not the room next door, and Dan for putting this discussion together. I think this is probably the third or fourth Power Africa discussion we've done here at CSIS. I think at the initial launch of the program and then over the years, I think the last one that we had hosted was on the LNG handbook that was put out towards the end of last year. Clearly, this is an important strategic priority for lots of people and has been really the hallmark of not only the world that I live in, which is the energy community, but also folks in the development community looking at ways that the U.S. can more broadly engage across a range of these issues. For all of you here in the audience and watching online, we're really pleased to have with us a great panel of folks who have thought deeply and for a long time about engagement with this project, engagement in the sector, and really be able to help us navigate this discussion of, one, how to shore up the project or the program and make sure that it functions the right way. Two, answer a question about what's new, where should it go next, where can it add additional value. And three, I think an issue that was near and dear to Dan's heart in particular is where can it be replicated, either regionally or functionally. And so I think it's a very timely opportunity for those discussions. Just to introduce the panel really quickly, starting all the way on the right-hand side from your perspective, we've got Lee Zack, who is currently an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University Law Center, but prior to this, she was the United States Senate-confirmed director of USTDA in the Obama administration, and previously served as the deputy director and general counsel for the agency as well. Prior to joining USTDA, Ms. Zack was a partner at the Washington and Boston offices of a law firm with a very long name, which is Mintz, Levin, Kahn, Ferris, Glovsky, and Pepio PC. So there you go. Little shout out to Mintz and Company. Her immediately next to her is Catherine Steele, who Kate Steele is the energy director for Power Africa at USAID. She was previously the project lead for energy access and investment at Google, where she focused on expanding renewable energy and energy access in Africa and South Asia. And prior to that, she was an energy specialist in African Energy Unit of the World Bank and a program manager for Lighting Africa. Prior to the work with the World Bank, she also consulted on energy projects in South Africa, Tanzania, and Kenya. Welcome. And Nilmani Rubin is the Vice President for International Development at Tetra Tech, where she leads policy and engineering services for energy projects in developing countries. Previously, Nilmani served as the Senior Advisor for Global Economic Competitiveness at the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee, where she directed technology, trade, finance, and energy policy. On behalf of Chairman Royce, Nilmani spearheaded, and I'm going to ask her to talk about this, passage of the House Representatives legislation to promote internet access in developing countries. She also crafted and drove the unanimous passage of Electrify Africa Act to increase access to electricity in Africa that serves as the framework for the United States Power Africa Initiative. Thanks for being here. And then finally, last but not least, we've got, Mimi Nedeljkovic. I did that. I practiced. Thank you. Dr. Nedeljkovic is the president and CEO of the Initiative for Global Development, a nonprofit organization that engages corporate leaders to reduce poverty through business growth and investment in Africa. And prior to establishing his consulting practice, Dr. Nedeljkovic was director for business development and country director in Liberia for Buchanan Renewables, and he served in the administration of President George Bush for 1989 to 1993 as the U.S. Executive Director for African Development Bank in Cote d'Ivoire. So thank you all for being here, and I look forward to having a good discussion. You know, whenever we're going to talk about the present success of and potential future of an initiative, I really like to start with where it started. And so, Nilmani, I'd like to ask you about your experience and Congress's role in spearheading the Electrify Africa initiative and how this led to sort of the creation of Power Africa.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for that question. I think like every superhero story, you need the origin story, right? And so I worked for Chairman Royce, and he's a moderate Republican from Southern California. He's the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And he also helped write the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It's a bill that helps give trade preferences to African countries. And we're trying to figure out how it could be better. We're coming up with the reauthorization of AGOA, this bill. And we decided to look at 3 African countries, Liberia, Ghana, and Nigeria, to figure out why their experiences with AGOA were so different. So Nigeria was benefiting a lot, and Liberia wasn't benefiting at all. And we did a bipartisan staff DEL. So it was staff from on the Republican side and the Democratic side went together to figure this question out together. We all care about the solution. And we came back from the trip, all the people on the trip realized the problem wasn't trade capacity building, it was energy. You can't make the quality and quantity for the US market without electricity. And we saw complete alignment with where there was energy, they were able to make products to sell to the US. And in Liberia, where they had a real problem with energy, they couldn't. So we came back, we wrote a bill together in a bipartisan way, not like we wrote the first draft and then had the Dems comment on it. It was very much like we sat at a computer together, wrote this bill together. And we decided to share it with the administration. And we don't always in Congress share our draft bills with the administration, but we decided to be collaborative. And we sent it over to the Obama administration, and their response was, we are thinking the same thing. Which just really doesn't happen that often in this town, where you have people aligning on an issue, but with the same potential answers. And I think that we all hit the issue with the same secret sauce of what became Power Africa. It was that it had clear goals, it had unity of purpose within the government, and it had a market-based approach. So we incorporated their comments in the bill. We introduced the bill. A week later, President Obama announced the Power Africa initiative in Tanzania. And it took us a while to get the bill through Congress. But because the bill had been introduced, the administration built up Power Africa in a way that aligned with the bill. So when it finally did pass into law, they were already completely in compliance, and we were all like very much on this. We were actually exactly on the same page. At the time we moved the bill, it was the second term of the Obama administration. We had no idea who the next president would be, but we knew it would be a different president. And we thought it was really, really important to have a legislative framework to show continuity of this initiative, not just for our government, to tell our government what to do, but for the marketplace to understand that this isn't a fly-by-night idea. This is something that the American government is very committed to.
And so, here we are, 4 years on. You had a vision at a computer with a bunch of people from the other side of the aisle. How has it lived up to your expectations?
So to answer that question, I went through the bill. It had been a while since I looked at the bill. And I was like, okay, we had clear metrics. We had a megawatt number, and it's, we wanted installation of 20,000 megawatts by 2020. And then I looked at what the Power Africa has already done. They've already done more than 7,000 megawatts in financial close. And, we're not even at 2020. So they're on their way. 3/4 of those projects are in gas, and 3/4 of the projects are in renewable. So it's an interesting kind of split, but well on their way on megawatts, on their way on connections. We'd asked for 50 million people to be served by 2020, and Power Africa can now say that they've established 10 million connections, and that's not 10 million people, right? Because each connection serves like about 5 million, so they've actually met the goal. So when you look through it, you're like, they have been successful. Like, it's not an opinion thing. It's like you can look at the facts. We set out that they're on the way to measure their goal. And also, like, other organizations have done assessments of how Power Africa is doing. The OECD and the Center for Global Development have looked at it and done analysis, and it's really an exciting moment. I had the chance after the Hill to work for Tetra Tech, which is helping implement Power Africa on the ground. So it's a really fun moment to like kind of go from idea to implementation, to see what our teams are doing on the ground, like doing transaction advice or rewriting the rules, helping rewrite the rules in the country, or helping deals come together and knocking heads and moving things forward. But I think overall, like just on the facts, you can go, well, this has been a success. It's done well for Africa, but there's some things that have been good that we actually didn't put in the bill that are really important. What we've seen Power Africa do is also create a lot of opportunity for American companies. So you've seen more than 60 American companies participate in Power Africa. You've seen Power Africa help create well over 1,000 U.S. jobs by the end of, when you look at the kind of the power stream of the deals, thousands more American jobs will be created. And that was not the intention of the program itself, but I do think it shows the major benefits of Power Africa, not just to the continent of Africa, but to the American people.
Well, great. I'm going to come back to you for some further ideas and jump around the panel here a little bit. But Lee, I wanted to go to you next because you, as director of USTDA, you were part of seeing how the sausage was made in the coordination of all of this Power Africa initiative. What are some of the challenges that were experienced along the way in the course of the program, but then also in terms of operationalizing the vision? But then, too, what do you think are some of the things that positively came out of that?
Thanks very much. And I saw Dan just stepped out for a second, but I want to start by thanking CSIS. One, because they've really been a thought leader, but they've also been a thought listener. And that's really hard to do. So thank you very much for doing sessions like this. With respect to Power Africa, you're absolutely right. I was absolutely thrilled to be in Africa with President Obama when it was launched. And I think that was a very important part of Power Africa, which was it had leadership, that it really demonstrated that it was a major priority of the U.S. government, that it was going to be a focus of everyone coming together. And so, in addition, I totally agree with Nilmini that one of the very important parts of it was having goals, intangible goals. Another piece was this having leadership with respect to Power Africa. The coordination effort also was something that was very important. USAID has done a phenomenal job. Andy is tremendous in coordinating the effort. But again, I think one of the things that was different about Power Africa from many of the other initiatives was this was also coordinated at the White House level. The NSC was extremely involved from the very beginning. Meetings were had not only with AID and all the members, but were had at the White House with respect to this and NSC. So it was clearly in everyone's mind that this was a priority, and that I think really was demonstrated to the private sector and to others that this was a priority. I think, the coordination always takes a little bit of time, but I think, USDA has had, because we're at the early project planning of projects, we're accustomed to coordinating with other agencies. But I think what people don't realize, and it was even a discussion we had, this morning, they don't realize that Power Africa were not just the financing agencies, but also the technical agencies. DOE was involved, other agencies with their expertise were involved as well. So, this was quite a thing to be able to coordinate. So, but they got it down. And I think one of the things that was extremely important in that coordination effort was, I think that this is an example of actually smaller can be faster, but working together can be even better. So working under one brand was extremely important, but allowing each agency to do its own thing, to follow its own mission. And from USTDA's point of view, I think one of the things that we brought that then was demonstrated later that people hadn't really thought about at the beginning was this U.S. private sector piece. USTDA's mission was focused on economic development and bringing jobs in the United States, U.S. exports. So because we were doing that project planning at the very beginning, it actually filtered through Power Africa so that we have the numbers we have today. We have a win-win situation as a result. So I think the last thing I would say, USTDA, I come from an environment there where we basically track the results very carefully. It was really interesting to watch other agencies have to go through that process. That some of them hadn't tracked the results, didn't have measurements, didn't know how to measure, and frankly, even down to basic things like didn't have the computer capacity to be able to measure, which I can be sympathetic with. But this was something I think that really was valuable. It was across the government, a system of measurement and a discipline to not only set a goal, but be able to measure your results against those goals.
One question I'd like to ask folks from TDA in particular, Lee, but you mentioned it when we were talking before the session. Has the government spent a lot of money on this initiative?
Yes is the bottom line. But one of the things is not nearly as much money as the private sector has. And I think that's the thing that people don't realize, which is Power Africa is a catalyst. It sets the platform for the private sector to be able to come in and invest even more money. And what it has done is it's attracted private investment, not only from the US, but basically around the world. And one of the things, I used to love to say is I love to spend other people's money. And basically that's what it allowed us to do, to set up a program, to set up a plan that would bring in other people, and including on the continent. There's money there available through pension funds, et cetera, but they just didn't know what were the best projects, how to be able to employ it. So I think that's the other really fantastic part about Power Africa. Yes, there was a lot of US government money that was focused on this, but the bang for the buck can't be beat.
That's great, thank you. Kate, I wanted to turn to you now. We've kind of gotten from the process of its origination to some of the early days, and you're currently the energy director at USAID, and Lee just said USAID plays a very big role in coordinating some of the activities that are going on in Power Africa. Can you sort of describe what's going on today? What is that you want people to know about how the project is running today? And then we'll talk about some of your expectations for where it's going to go.
Sure, so I can handle the adolescent to adult years. Now that we've covered the origin story. First, I also do want to thank CSAS for convening not only this, but other sessions on Power Africa, as well as thanking Dan for saying it would be colossally stupid to cancel Power Africa. I do agree with that statement. So I think where we've come to now, Nomani already gave some of our top line results. Power Africa was launched initially focusing on megawatts and connections. Megawatts were at over 7,300 megawatts, reaching financial close from 82 projects across sub-Saharan Africa. Connections, we're looking at over 10 million connections. A large number right now of those are off-grid. So a lot of this is not the central grid systems, but the off-grid solar home systems and things like that. But I will say that probably is undercounting everything we've done in distribution. We work a lot with utilities. Maybe to Lee's point on counting, we've been a little unsure of how to take credit for the work we're doing with utilities. So I think we actually vastly undercount the number of grid connections we have made through wanting to be really honest about how we count those. But we're working with utilities across sub-Saharan Africa, improving their operations, improving their losses, or reducing their losses, and helping them roll out grid connections to new areas. So where we are right now, I think we're feeling good about the success that we have had. I think we've proven the model. I think we've proven the interagency collaboration is really important. I think we've proven focusing on some top-line results is really important. But now I think we are moving into the next phase. And the next phase means that to achieve the Electrify Africa Act goals by 2020 and to achieve Power Africa's goals by 2030, we've still got a lot of work to do. And I think where we see that work needing to focus is on more of the overall system for electrification. And so that means looking a lot more closely at transmission. We have countries where they are going slower on generation right now because there's not a system to evacuate the power. There's not an ability to sell the power to another market. And so we think that is essential to being able to grow the power systems overall and to make it more economic across the regions. So I think that's one area we'll be focusing a lot more. Distribution and utilities. And like I said, I think we've been doing quite a bit with this, but figuring out how we can expand that substantially. Because it's great to get power onto the grid. If the power is not actually getting to households and businesses, then it's not really doing what it needs to be doing. And underpinning both of those, as well as our megawatts and connections goals overall, is the enabling environment. And I think this is really it's a terrible headline to be talking about, what did you do in regulatory reform? But it's the really essential part of getting the private sector in. And I think that's where Power Africa really works across both sides. So we have over 130 private sector partners, a number of them US companies that we're working with, where we want to mitigate their risk. And we'll do that through tools like USTDA, bring in project feasibility studies. We'll do it through OPIC financing. We'll do it through information we can provide on the ground through USAID, all of our other partners. So we try and mitigate those risks, but there's still going to be countries that aren't going to attract that private sector investment without having the enabling environment improved, without having the rule of law improved. So I think that's the really critical work that we will do through USAID, through State Department, through a number of the other Power Africa partners, and really in working with African governments, because it's essential to have that political will in order to make it happen. But I think to Lee's point, we want to do all of this to bring in the private money. That the estimate, this is McKinsey's number, but I'll say it's the ballpark figure I've seen, is for universal access for full electrification systems in Africa, the price tag is $835 billion. We're not bringing that in from US government, and African governments aren't bringing it in themselves, and you're not going to see it come in from the development banks. The money is sitting with the private sector, and so we need to do what we can to be able to unlock that money. That's really the goal of Power Africa.
Thank you. So, Mima, it's come up a couple times, a few times, at least 3 or 4, that part of the goal of the program is to catalyze private sector investment, and you work with the private sector, you are the private sector. What are the perceptions that you have from the projects you've been involved in of the program?
Thank you, Sarah. Again, CSIS, always wonderful discussions here. Industry perspective, and maybe just quick background. I mean, Initiative Global Development is a network of business CEOs and leaders worldwide. I think that's the most important point. Secondly, of that leadership, of that network, more than half is African. So, for us, as we say, we're US-based, world-centric, Africa-focused. We're really looking to bring the best around the world into Africa, maybe even if it comes from the moon, as I say. And this is, I think, where it's very interesting, where the intersection comes in with Power Africa. Because for us, the mission and the leaders are basically saying, listen, it's all about economic growth. We don't have economic growth. Everyone knows the billion, we're doubling population, 50% urbanization in Africa. This is something that if we don't have economic growth, we don't create jobs, we don't create opportunities, you're going to have one huge political explosion, and that's going to be felt worldwide. How do you do it? Short of electricity and power, you're not going to do it. It's all about value addition. It's all about industrialization. Anything having to do with creating opportunities and economic growth is underpinned by power, full stop. Numini mentioned, this whole issue with AGOA, and I had the pleasure in previous years, and I've really come out more out of the agro-industrial sector and cogeneration on the power side with Chairman Royce, when at that time was heading up the Africa Committee on AGOA. I mean, she pointed exactly the reason why AGOA was not working in initial phases. You're not competitive. African countries were not competitive to be able to export. It doesn't matter if you open the markets, if I can't produce competitively. And biggest part of that competitivity is power. So I think that is now recognized clearly. We have a power task force. It's, all the U.S., the various companies, producers, Contour Global, Symbion, you have Endeavor, GE, you name it, the generation side. There is a big issue on the transmission. There's no question. We'll come back to that when we have discussion. Big issue on the utilities. There's a big issue on the whole structuring of power purchase agreements, PPAs. A task force developed it came under Commerce, but it's really with the Africa Legal Support Facility within the African Development Bank, understanding PPAs and standardizing it. Because the issue is, on the one side, yes, you need the gigawatts in the big power plants, but you also need power in the rural areas, in the secondary cities. Off-grid solutions, mini-grids, you name it. And I'm going now beyond the COPA model and just electrifying one refrigerator. The issue is renewables are now coming down into cost-competitive capabilities, structures, where it's interesting to be able to bring in private money. So what has it done? The most important and valuable thing Power Africa has done is really created that platform to catalyze the interest, to even make attention, bring the attention to PE firms, to pension funds, to private money, to investors, that in fact there's a lot of money out there. The issue is not money. The issue is structure. And this is where you now come back to the most critical role. And if we're going to put steroids inside Power Africa, I think beyond the dollars, and if you really want to get the other people's money in here, that is getting the African political leadership to understand what it is that it takes to bring in private monies. You've got to be able to get returns, proper structure, ability to do simple PPAs, guaranteed contracts, pulling them out. That is, again, this is where the utilities come in as key, because this is where you're dealing with non-creditworthy utilities. How do you go and get the financing together? So for me, that part is understood by the U.S. private sector, world private sector, clearly the African private sector. The biggest issues our African companies and leaders are having is being competitive, and that's power, that's infrastructure. And we can speak separately about the whole human infrastructure requirement. So that ability to catalyze and bring to attention is the greatest value. Now everybody, since Power Africa, Electrify Africa, ADB's got its piece, the French have got theirs, everybody's doing, which is great, at least got people's attention. What needs to still happen is, it's like a laser gun. You got to laser down to that political leadership in the countries And most of the time, it's going to have to go right up to the head of state to say, okay, this is what needs to happen. Or if you don't, I mean, there is the other. We're going to have the discussion about the Chinese. There's the other model. You just go Chinese, they come with a checkbook, but guess what? You just hock the next 20 years of your gas. If you're Ghanaian, or the next, if you're Guinea, it's your iron ore. It doesn't matter. But the key, I think, when we get into that discussion is getting the governments and the political leadership in the African countries to understand, here's the choices. People want it. The business leaders want the American product. They want American capabilities and know-how. The issue is getting that understood by their own political leaders to then make it amenable that we can come with that private capital to create the opportunities.
That's great. So I want to pick up on that theme, and I'm going to sort of ask each of you on this particular topic to offer some thoughts, which is there's an idea that Power Africa has been very good at creating megawatt hours, and you said maybe undercounting some of the connections on the transmission side as well, but really very good transactively. But when it comes to the enabling environment, those broader, longer-term issues of the electric power sector and how to make it function in a way that is more durable consistently, what is it precisely from each of your perspectives that Power Africa specifically can do, not to solve all of those issues at once, but make incremental steps in the direction of being able to solve some of those issues, whether it's through the role of Congress or the role of the private sector, or how you operate the sort of intergovernmental coordination of this. Is there a way of incrementally doing this? Because one of the things I worry about when I hear narratives like that is part of the success of the program is it's been so targeted and specific. If it gets too broad too quickly, maybe some of that goes away. Is that something that you each think about? And I'm happy to start with whoever wants to start. Please, Lee.
And I know that others are going to have more to contribute, but I do think one of the very important aspects of Power Africa, and one that I would continue, is the focus on advisors. Both advisors to the government as well as advisors to the private sector in country. And frankly, I think the points that all of us have made, I think developing the human capital in country is extremely important. One of the things if I had something on my wish list outside of the USTDA, with someone using someone else's money, I would have loved to have developed Energy University, to be able to develop the human capital, because it's not just here, change this law, but why do you need to change this law? Why is this in your interest? How can you get the best deal? You're holding back on something that's not important when you're negotiating. So I do think that for Power Africa, I think we've been moving forward. I was a transaction lawyer, so I love transactions. But I do think that I also love education, and I think that the educational aspect is something that we could invest a little more in.
Sure. So this is something we think about a lot, because I think it would be very easy for us if there was a clear direction of what is the ideal energy sector, and there's a step-by-step process where you would go through to find that. I think that would make all of this easier for everyone. But it's not like that. I think countries have taken different approaches to how they reform their sector. When we talk about our transaction approach, it's largely that we want the transactions to drive where are the bottlenecks. So instead of waiting while we try and create this idealized energy sector, we look at what's the critical factor right now that is preventing investment there, and try and work on that first. That doesn't mean we won't eventually get to everything else, but we try and look at that first. And one of the ways we find out about that is through our private sector partners, through our transaction advisors who are on the ground, through the transaction agencies, so USTDA and OPIC and EXIM and others that are looking at projects, what's getting stuck for them. And then we look at what tools Power Africa has to try and address that. And we have a lot of tools to address this, whether it's from Department of Commerce has the Commercial Law and Development Program. We've had great success with them developing these handbooks. There's one on understanding power purchase agreements, one on project finance, and one on LNG issues. And I think that's been one where we try and get them out to as broad an audience as possible in African governments where they can really be using them for training purposes. Incidentally, we do have a training academy as far as the YALI Institute, the Young African Leaders Institute, focused on energy. From some of our other partners, State Department, we've engaged econ officers in country. We've also engaged higher level State Department officials to try and make these cases for why reform needs to happen. From USAID, we have a lot of tools. We work with partners like the National Association of Regulatory Utilities Commission, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's NARUC, who has been doing a lot of fantastic work on reforming tariffs, which, like I said, is not a great headline to talk about, but is something that's essential for making utilities bankable, making utilities be able to be creditworthy off-takers for generation. We work closely with the U.S. Energy Association. They've done a lot of work to try and, again, do trainings on the ground. We have embedded advisors in a lot of institutions. But I think the really critical thing that we try and do is figure out what tools we can deploy, and again, what are the critical things that need to happen first, and try and attack that first.
In the bill, it did have about a discussion about megawatts and connections, but the third part was on energy reforms. It's just that we don't talk about it as much because you don't check the box like we did 5 energy reforms in this country, right? That's not how we think about things. So it doesn't get as much play because it's not a number. But we have teams on the Tetra Tech side, that have gone in and helped do legal frameworks for geothermal in Ethiopia, or revised a grid code in Kenya. So you have people who are going out and doing those reforms. So because the point of transaction advisors isn't just to do that one transaction and get that done so we get numbers on the board for Power Africa. It's to clear the way so those transactions can be done in the future easily. The whole idea is how does Power Africa transform this market? So these are just leading investments, and they're leading the way for these markets to be sustainable, so that eventually we can move out. So I did want to point out there. The other thing in the bill, it requires the administration to coordinate with international partners, so to coordinate with the international financial institutions in other countries. And so Power Africa is coordinating not only the 12 government agencies, but it's working with 15 bilateral and multilateral partners. And so they can use those multilateral partners to leverage change. So in Ghana, Power Africa has worked with the World Bank and to help change the policy around independent power producers. So there's a lot going on that's just a little bit harder to measure, and also because you're doing it with partners, does Power Africa get credit for that, or does the World Bank get credit for that, or does the country that's making the change get credit for that? And probably where the credit is due. So. But policy reform really it's not frosting, it's really part of the cake.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
If I can just segue off this understanding the power purchase agreement handbook, because that actually was the back office thought leadership was produced by a task force. I came in kind of the middle of it. It's about 3.5 years ago. I think the key, once we produce a document, I come in, I'm a practical person, I say, okay, this is wonderful. So let's just go and collect dust somewhere on somebody's bookshelf. What are we going to do with it? So we got some other foundation money to go and really try 3-4 pilot countries that our members say, here's where we're looking at doing it. Turned out to be, in this case, a couple of difficult countries, Guinea and Liberia, Guinea and Sierra Leone, and then Botswana on the solar side. But I'm using this because we went through then that case because the Africa Legal Support Facility is a key player. It's inside the ADB, the African Development Bank, aid-funded, Power Africa, all kinds of different people. Why was it important setting up? And I recall many moves before USAID at the African Development Bank. And, having gone out, I said, people, you cannot negotiate with yourself. I don't care if that's power or it's my agro deals or whatever, infrastructure, doesn't matter. You cannot negotiate with yourself. And the biggest problem for developers is you go in and you negotiate, and Lee mentioned earlier, with whom? With an empty stare across the table. That is the problem. So everything gets agreed to, but then you go to financing, and in fact, the government really cannot finally, in the end, execute what they agreed to. So I tell the lawyer, I said, well, this is great. You won the legal battle, but I can't go put together the financing because they can't execute what they agreed to. That is something not understood, and is maybe the most important thing the advisors really be doing. But it's not just the transactions. On top of that, you have to, what I was saying earlier at breakfast time, you have to have the come to Jesus discussion with the heads of state, with the ministers, the key people. And that's not going to be the advisors. At this point, if Power Africa really wants to be powerful, so to speak, the U.S. ambassador, whoever the top gun is for the U.S. government in that country, has got to speak, because that individual is the one who's got that authority there. And this is where I've seen now, both Numini and I sit on the advisory council of the MCC, Millennium Challenge. When we go in, there's a bunch of different power projects. The last one that we looked at was Benin that went in. And the most important question in the end we had in input from our side, if you will, as it was being developed, why is it not working? What is the issue? The issue, government's not paying their bills. They own the utility. It's the non-creditworthy utility. So how do we solve that? I mean, this is where the Jesus discussion has come. You have to pay your bills, or I was even suggesting take part of your MCC compact, put it aside in an LC that backs up any time you don't pay your bill. Because, we get lost in these big definitions of, we need contract, the contract authorities and this and that. That one lawyer, remember the one on the advisory council, it's very simple. I don't care, it's not the contract issue. The issue is, do I get paid or not? Do I get the cash? So how you solve it? Put an LC aside. But the government's going to have to understand that. That's the key part, I think, the biggest value Power Africa can bring in with these advisors. Not the technical transaction, but the mental transaction to understand, here's how the real world operates.
Nobody not to put you on the spot, but is there anything that Congress can do to increase the capability of Power Africa as it currently is?
Yes, there is. Congress could make sure it's fully funded.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's great to have a wonderful plan, but we do need resources to fund it. The bill, the authorization bill for Electrify Africa, it didn't actually include a number in that bill. The funding numbers for Power Africa have been through appropriations. And so we need to make sure that the overall foreign aid account is fully funded. We're in a really critical moment to make sure that foreign aid is fully funded. And we also need to make sure that once that's fully funded, that Power Africa is given the resources that it needs, and it's not divvied up into other projects that might not have as much impact on growth, security, and stability.
Thank you for that. I want to pivot in a second to something that I know we focused a little bit on tangentially, but there's this idea that Power Africa has done something that's really effective, which put priorities within multi-government agencies and as you rightly pointed out, across multilateral development institutions as well on one particular issue, and that really helped. And there's a question of whether we can replicate that in other places. But before we leave energy in Africa for 1 minute, for those of you who are, all engaged in Power Africa, but also had a private sector experience or past, there's a lot that's changing in the energy sector right now. We tend to think about this as a government innovation to help catalyze investment in a space, but I'm amazed on a daily basis to see the kind of, whether it's the reduction in cost for renewables that you're seeing in some of the auctioning, or whether it's just the kind of innovation and business cycle and approach. Can you talk, if anyone has any anecdotes or reflections on some of the changes you're seeing just in the energy capabilities and sector in Africa, whether it's on renewables or gas or whatever the case might be, what has been striking to you over the period of time that you've been working in this space? Yeah.
The two that I would point to, one, I acknowledge, I think you're absolutely correct. We're seeing it change very quickly. The two that we're watching the most closely and seeing the most change in are changes in gas and solar. And I think I see some nods and everyone's like, oh yeah, that's really obvious. So I'll be quick on this point. I think on solar, there's been a pretty precipitous price drop. I think there's been a lot of developers waiting for solar to be truly economic and truly cost competitive in Africa. We have seen that threshold crossed in a number of projects. These are centralized projects. We've seen that crossed in the past several years, where we're getting a number of countries that are doing competitive tenders for the first time and getting really, really low prices as a result. And most recently, the past several years, Power Africa has been very engaged with countries that wanted to do these tenders for the first time. And this isn't just South Africa. We've seen it in Malawi and Zambia and Ethiopia, and we think that's going to continue. And I think solar's really enabled, even starting from several years ago, the off-grid market. And this is not just a technology innovation, but also a financing innovation, where people are using power where it is going to be consumed in their household, but able to finance a small system that is able to take advantage of incredibly efficient appliances and using televisions and radios, as well as cell phone charging and lights. So I think solar is really revolutionary, both for the access part of it, but also will increasingly be part of grids. On the gas side, we know that there's been a lot of discoveries of gas resources off of both East and West Africa. But I think the thing that is changing significantly right now is the U.S. export of LNG. And I think that that's really shifted the terms of the contracts and the making it a much more commoditized resource, and where I think you'll see a lot more flexibility in the contracting and a lot more importation of LNG. And we have a number of countries that, even as they wait for their own resources to come online, we would start to see them importing, hopefully from the U.S., but importing gas in the interim.
That's great. Any other thoughts? Yeah,
Yeah, and I really want to come back, I think, the solar. I mean, solar really is a bit of a secret sauce in there, because the cost of it is coming down big time. I know within a year, a couple of years anyway, on the storage issue. But for the African standpoint, keep in mind, you have heavy urbanization, which 50% will be maybe the more traditional, the big power stations. Okay, fuel them with whatever you want to fuel them. The other 50% are still the secondary and smaller towns. So unless we become 100% urbanized, we better start figuring out how to get power also to the medium-sized secondary cities and rural areas. And I think this is where technology is really changing, because the cost, while yes, transmission is necessary, we'll have a grid going out. In the meantime, it's a little bit like the cell phone. Is technology moving fast enough that the generator at source power with mini-grid, closed loops, call it what you want, become part of the answer? In the end, you say, you know what, we're not going to put the big grid lines going forward. Maybe that stays in industrial centers, but let's start creating those secondary, and that's often food, value addition, the light industry that doesn't require heavy base load, but needs some power. Your mango dryers, processors, sugar mills, rice mills, doesn't matter. Most of those also have discards. I mean, the powers, the sugar factory Schaefer is built around, every one of them cogens, 15, 20, 30 megs. If the environment's right, we get a good price. You put higher boilers, you're producing more electricity. Rice husk, rice mills. So every one of so the key on the renewables is or hydro even, happens to be in the very areas that are off-grid. That's why it's interesting. We keep thinking of, and I hate to keep using the MCOPA example, but it's not just solar for the unitary apartments or houses in the villages or the cities. It's the 20, 30, 40, 50 megs that are coming off of solar now. 30 come off of biomass in the closed loop that will create the ability for that light industry to start operating in the I don't know, the Tamales of the world, West Africa, the secondary cities. That is the key. The price point is getting there. You're absolutely right. So I think that is really where we need to be also putting a big focus on. Thank you.
And just one more thing. Again, clearly gas has been extremely important, but since we were talking about solar and talking about price coming down, I think the other thing is, innovations with respect to storage are absolutely phenomenal. And it's one of the things that USTDA just completed funding a report for South Africa focusing on different storage options. And I have to confess, I'm probably the only person who goes on safari and asks them if I can see their solar field and storage ability. So I actually just came back yesterday, and where I was, they're totally solar, and they have these wonderful Tesla batteries, storage. So I have pictures on my cell phone if anyone wants to see it. But I do think that technology today is playing a really important role in energy, and I do think that you're going to see a real sort of leapfrog with respect to technology in place in the developing world and emerging markets.
So I want to pivot to that issue that we were talking about, which is, which I mentioned before, which is where could this as a model be replicated, either regionally or geographically? I'm going to start with Nilmini, because I think I also want to get to this issue of what's the rationale for choosing? Is it the place where there's the most need? It's the place where we've got capability? How do we choose what you could expand this to next if you think it is a good model?
I'd start with what is the model, right? The model with Power Africa is that it's got a clear unity of purpose, clear goals, and it's a market-based approach on something that has major impact. So it's these two tools, the unity of purpose, market-based approach, but it's not just on anything. It's on something that can like lift all boats. So I would start when thinking about where can we use this by agreeing with Senator Perdue, a Republican of Georgia, who on TV said that the Power Africa was a really great model to increase private sector financing for infrastructure that we should use or consider for the United States. Because we're trying to think about infrastructure in our own country. This actually is a model that works. This is not just a developing country idea. How do we crowd in the private sector? We need to do that here too. And so I would first start with the United States. Then I would look into other regions, like what other, like electricity, it's the electromagnetic platform of the industrial age, right? That's really why it's such a powerful sector. What's the electromagnetic platform of the information age, this new age that we're going into? It's the internet. And so I think that this model is ripe for application in internet access in developing countries. After the Electrify Africa Act, I had the honor of writing the Digital Gap Act for Chairman Royce, which really kind of was the next phase. What we looked at, how do we increase internet access in developing countries? It's not an Africa-centric approach like Power Africa was. It's really a global, like how to use the market to leverage internet access around the world. So I would definitely look at agriculture as well. It's also a market-based sector that can have outsized impact on people's lives and food security. So I think that there's definitely different areas, but I would also add that when we think about what we could do next with this type of model, it's thinking about like what as the American people do we bring? What's our strength? And our strength is our ingenuity and our business sense, our market-based approach, and that's really fundamental.
That's great, thank you. Lee, I want to go to you next for some ideas.
Well, I definitely agree with respect to one of the next phases is focusing on IT and digital connections. I will say, about 10 years ago, USTDA was working with the State Department on some of these issues, and I think it's time for us to be looking at them again. I think the energy platform, as was mentioned, is incredibly important, but then it's taking the next step. So I clearly see that there's a market for that and here, and it's also from our clients at USTDA that they see a market, and it's also another great win-win. It's an area where the U.S. has the innovation, they have the technology, where they can help to bring that to other parts of the world. I would also include in this transportation. It is the other piece, in particular in Africa, and I think IT can be applied, in Africa, in Asia, but transportation in Africa, I think, is also a very important piece. Because going back to trade, and a little bit of what's limiting trade is the cost of getting the good from where it is to the border, or getting it to a port. It is absolutely amazing that to be able to get a car from South Africa to other parts of Africa, you have to fly it. You can't take it on a train, you can't take it on a road. So transportation, and again, this is an area that the private sector is interested in, you can get a return on, and the U.S. business is very interested in. So those are additional areas and additional sectors that I look at.
Yeah, because there's all three areas absolutely critical, and again, coming out of industry, it's where we are most competitive, U.S. I mean, the internet is the discussion we often have, MCC, that tech lens, sort of, where are we strongest? I mean, you look at Africa, and people keep talking about the cell phones. Well, people are not having cell phones only because they want to be speaking to each other. A lot of information is going through that cell phone. Those are the smartphones. And that's all basically internet-driven, and will be further driven as such. So anything where there's a customer, a buyer, a payer, is really where you focus it. And that can be internet, that could be by certainly infrastructure, ports, roads, and airports, because I always used to say on our agro-industry, we had plant, I can control all my costs on the plant. That's not my problem. My problem is what it costs from farm gate to the market. And if the market's overseas through that port, and then get clogged. That's why I'm not competitive. That's why Africa's not competitive. So absolutely, and that will, people will pay, business will pay for that. So those are the ones where you can crowd in the private sector investment. But the one part, and this is really dear to the IGD mission, is agriculture is a business. I mean, that, if there's anything the U.S. knows how to do, is value addition to food products. And that is the most biggest growing sector in the economy because of urbanization. Everybody's moving to cities, no longer farmers. Forget that image of the old African small farmer. It's an old lady over 60 years old right now. The kids are all in the cities. So you better start looking at agriculture as a business, and that's where then the opportunities come in. So Feed the Future began, so the importance, food security. I would say food, agriculture, agribusiness is a business. That you're going to solve then the food problems, not through security, but through business interests.
Okay, so Kate, we've heard infrastructure in the U.S., IT, agriculture, transportation in Africa, focusing on where we can be competitive, where there's a market environment, those sorts of things. I want you to add to that list, but also, is there a way that Power Africa could just be regionally deployed elsewhere?
Sure. I think the benefit of going last is that most of the good ideas have already been put out there. So I'll take the geographic
I'm
question.
assume you had all of them in.
I can first say I agree with everything that's been said. I think if you're looking at where Power Africa could go next or where it's needed next, it goes back to fundamentally what are we trying to do? And so I think we are trying to address energy access and economic development through that creation of trading partners with the U.S. And I think we're trying to drive private sector investment. And I think from that, there's a lot of areas we could go to. The greatest access challenge right now is still within South Asia and pieces of Southeast Asia. Even though if you look at, it's hard to generalize anything about India, but there are states that have had a lot of private investment in the power sector, and there are other ones that have had very, very little. So I think that there's quite a bit more that could be done to drive private investment into power sector in India and help transform some of those state electricity boards. I think there's still significant challenges in countries like Bangladesh, where there's a very difficult country to electrify. I think a lot of the off-grid models are very successful there. Same thing if you go into increasingly some of the difficult ones, Myanmar, which is building out its electrification system, challenging archipelago countries like Indonesia and the Philippines. I think there's a lot that could be done to bring in private investment. And then I think even in some of the more advanced markets in South and Latin America, I think that there's still a lot of, we would love to get more U.S. companies into there and more investment into the power sectors there. I will say, so when I worked at Lighting Africa, it was only Lighting Africa at that point, and then it's now called Lighting Global. And it went from Lighting Africa to Lighting Asia and Lighting Latin America before finally becoming Lighting Global. So I think there is, if you're looking at a market transformation model and a private sector driven model, there's a need for it pretty much everywhere.
Okay, I wanted to open it up to the audience for questions. We have a few ground rules here. Please wait for the microphone because we are webcasting. State your name and affiliation, and hopefully question in the form of a question would be great if you're able to swing it. So we've got one right here and then one in the back.
If you could identify yourself. You want me to stand up? I'm Terry Hill with the Passive House Institute and the Emerge Alliance. So my interest is in the role of direct current in the future, and also tying it in with energy efficient buildings. And the other thing that seems to be, I was up on the hill a couple of weeks ago, and somebody said to me, it's all very well to have microgrids. There are all sorts of microgrids, but we need to drive the price of the microgrid down so that more people can afford the services that these bigger grids would have. Thank you.
Anyone want to talk about pricing of microgrids?
I'll take microgrids as well, as I think I'm the only one who wants to talk about DC energy or DC power. So on microgrids, it's challenging when you have a small system to make it cost effective and yet meet the needs of all of the customers. I think we have this funny dichotomy in the grid and off-grid world where grid is heavily publicly subsidized and rolled out through public institutions, frequently public utilities, and off-grid has largely been the purview of private sector, where it's privately funded and customers simply pay directly for the service. I think we actually need to switch a bit of that, where we get even more private investment into utilities and public money into the off-grid sector. And I think that's where microgrids are kind of lost in the middle there, where you have a lot of publicly funded systems that are very, very expensive, and then you have privately funded systems that are honestly not entirely commercially viable. And I think something that's more of a public-private partnership is probably where that's going to shake out, unless there's a really substantial technical innovation that drops the price for it. On the technology side of it, DC, we are seeing more and more DC. For the quick version, most power that's sent out by the grid is alternating current. If you have power coming off of a battery or solar panel, it's direct current. Almost anything you use that has electronics in it actually uses direct current in it. So you have a lot of switching back and forth in the middle to make sure that you can power your electronics. If you look at a solar home system, it doesn't switch it back and forth. It largely just does DC comes out, and it's DC appliances that are being used. I think as power electronics get cheaper and cheaper, we'll be less concerned about whether the power that's produced or consumed is AC versus DC, and you'll just switch it back and forth as needed.
I'll stay out of the DC AC argument, but discussion. But the question I want to bring back, we're talking about Power Africa and cost issues. And people keep saying, well, we're bringing the cost and bringing it down. Well, they're forgetting that those out-of-the-way places that are still 50% of the continent, until the grid comes, whether it's direct, I don't care in what fashion, the cost is 50 cents per kilo. It's called Tiger generators. It's called diesel fuel. That, in fact, people say, Africa doesn't have power producers. My answer is no. Every single person is a power producer. We all got backup generators. Everybody go to the villages. Everybody go anywhere you want to go, you got Tiger. The Tiger, I think, is the brand. People call them Tigers, like Kleenex. So we have to remember that while we're waiting for the wonderful, great solution that's going to come 20 years from now, I got to live in the meantime, and I'm paying 45, 50 cents. I had this discussion in Liberia with the Buchanan story. We were trying to use wood chips, and for different reasons, the thing didn't end up happening. But the whole question was, well, Mount Coffee's coming. It's going to bring it down. Hydro at 16 cents. That's great. That was 12 years ago. You did, I don't know how many studies out of TDA on Mount Coffee until it comes. So part of it is also looking at packets and how quickly do we need to get response to answers to people that are now paying 45, 50 cents. Maybe it's 40 cents because oil is less costly. That is the difference. That's the key, I think, it needs to be remembered.
For the record, Mount Coffee is operational.
But it is operational now. It is operational. But it took 20 years.
Okay, right there.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Alfonso Guzman, and I work with K&M Advisors, a transaction advisory firm. And my question is building on what Mima said with respect to political will. How does Power Africa deal with countries that need power, where there's private capital that is interested in the project, but at the highest level, the decision makers, they're politically not committed to doing those projects with private capital? And I asked the question, we have a mandate in Tanzania funded by the World Bank to do a transaction, prepare it, competitively procure it for a 250 megawatt gas plant. But we're stuck because at the highest level, there's no political will to move forward with that project.
Yes, in fact, that was right at the top of it. If you look at my notes, it says political will with an exclamation mark. The key is exactly in there, because in the end, social media, you know what's going to fix political will? Social media. Because everybody in the biggest, smallest bush village knows what's going on. And the street will not tolerate anymore politicians that do not respond. I think that is really what is making the big change. And why, and come back to the advisor side, and where we really, as Power Africa, can be most effective, and that is, again, how do you support that political will to, and it's going to be head of state by and large, it certainly is in Tanzania, is what our chief of mission, in the end, whoever it is saying to that head of state. Full stop. That is where the rubber meets the road. But it is absolutely key. Without it, it ain't going to work. And if it doesn't result is, the street comes out.
And jumping in on especially that last comment with respect to the mission, I think it really is political will on both sides. And I was in a situation where I was in a country where someone got notice that their power purchase agreement was about to be canceled. The ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, and I and Mike Froman went and met with the president of the country and indicated why this would be bad. Not necessarily just bad for this particular project, but bad for their reputation, bad for being able to do any of these projects again in the future. So I think in addition to the things that we talked about, it really is a relationship, a one-on-one. It is the ambassador, and they did a tremendous job. The State Department was really wonderful when we were working with them. And frankly, it has to come all the way from the top in the U.S. that they're supporting their U.S. companies, and that these things are important in the process.
Hi, my name is Eric. I'm with the Energy Information Administration.
We love EIA.
I had yeah, it's a mouthful. I had one question. Do you see the energy mix that you are currently working on right now shifting more towards large-scale, complex projects like hydro, oil or gas-fired power plants? I was wondering if you could just comment on that.
I wouldn't say we see it shifting necessarily towards that. We support all of the above and support projects that make sense. So I think that there are still some large-scale projects that will get built and should get built, which we'll be supportive of. But I think we're also starting to see a proliferation of smaller projects that are closer to where the power will be consumed, require less lengthy transmission lines. So I think we'll see a mix of everything.
I just wanted to put a period on the all of the above. Like, that's a really important point.
It's in the act.
that Kate brought up. So it's in the bill, and it says all of the above, and it lists out all of the definition of all, which is all. And I think that that's a really important point to emphasize, because when people do criticize Power Africa, sometimes it's people who have certain interests in different types of energy, and they feel that their type of energy is not getting as much attention as it should. And I just want to make clear that it is all, and it's good for the continent that for their own development reasons, but also politically in the United States, it was really important to make sure it was all and not focused on a certain type.
Elizabeth Bradley with Blackburn Frontiers. I wanted to ask about the kind of early stages of project development and project origination. One of the most difficult things that we see is in connecting developers with risk capital. And TDA has been an incredible resource in terms of funding feasibility studies and really helping to get projects off the ground, because we find that if you have a good project, there's no shortage of money to finance it. Right. So what are some of the recommendations and innovations that you're thinking about coming out of Power Africa in terms of helping to connect developers with additional sources of risk capital?
I'll definitely start with that one. Again, thank you very much, and thank you for working with USTDA. One of the innovations that USTDA had was, in addition to doing the project preparation, which is one of the things that we recognized was really needed. As everyone said, there was a lot of capital out there. What did not exist were well-prepared projects, and that's what USTDA did. So again, I'm incredibly thankful to Power Africa, thankful to USAID that transferred funds to USTDA to be able to do more of that. But one of the innovations that we added was, it's great if you do a feasibility study, but you need to connect it with the money. You need to be able to connect the people with the money. So what we did is we also brought on implementation managers to basically go from the point where a feasibility study was done to be able to work with a project sponsor or work with people in country and get it all the way connected to the source of financing. So again, thanks very much to USAID and to Power Africa, to Congress, and I second the fund Power Africa, but with again a little bit of money,
we were able to bring on implementation managers to make that connection, to make it work.
I definitely want to add on TDA because this is now going back 3 years before I came to IGD. My group, Schaefer Group, does the agro-industry, in fact, Spurnout, Buchanan, too, work very closely with TDA. The point you bring out is very important in that one of the biggest impediments to project development in Africa is that front-end pre-project development cost. It'll kill you. And this is where particularly the smaller deals are very difficult because you can't amortize in power all that time it takes. You can't spend 5 years negotiating. That's why the understanding PPA is standardizing them for smaller deals. But anything could be done on the front end. I call it salami financing. Any of the sort of public resource support until you get to the point that commercial money can come in is critical. That's why the grant financing from an MCC, for example, is so important because it really creates then the opportunity to leverage off of it. It's all about leverage. That's what TDA produces. This is what MCC does. And any of those tools, I don't know, you write laws, I don't know how laws are written, but anything that can actually help catalyze. The biggest value, I always say, to any U.S. government agency involvement is that catalytic effort. You're bringing in additional capital. It's that stimulus effect. It's very, very important. Thank you for that question.
To sort of riff off of that a little bit, I wanted to take a moment to recognize that 90% of financial flows to developing countries are from the private sector. And I think that many of us started out in development where many flows were from places like the World Bank or USAID, but it's 90% from the private sector. So I like to think of it a lot of like, how do we figure out ways to get those flows to projects that are catalytic and have development impact? And I think that that's a really maybe a different way to think about how we should think about our development finance institutions going forward. Can we maybe do more time on helping set up or kind of giving the imprimatur of the U.S. government or doing some of the background on different projects to help crowd private sector money in so that we're using less U.S. taxpayer money, but we're also benefiting from the strength of the United States, which is our private sector investment flows.
Just a brief point to say, one of the things we tried to do with Power Africa is not reinvent things that were already out there and try and bring additionality to things that were. So I think when we were looking at who had the comparative advantage, USTDA was already doing a project preparation facility. So it was in USAID's best interest to fund that if it was going to solve our problem of needing more money in that tool. We also looked, we actually found there were a lot of project preparation facilities out in the market. So one of the things we try and do instead of inventing our own new one is to actually drive deal flow towards those and making sure that they're fully utilized and can be connected to financing as well. I think that's where USTDA working with OPIC is a great fit. And whether or not the financing goes directly to OPIC or to another investor, I think TDA has really done a great job of teeing that up.
Good morning, I'm Jack Warner with the Institute for Sustainable Power. The question relates to standards and the whole framework, regulatory framework, and how standards are being developed in West Africa particularly, which is where I've been doing my work, but in Africa in general. And it relates to two things, one with USTDA and what you did with ANSI. I'm also an ANSI assessor and was involved in that project a little bit at the beginning that you had on contract with them on workshops. But also with IRENA, and I wanted to kind of focus a little bit on whether or not you can show some experiences that you've had in working in partnerships with an organization like IRENA in terms of developing standards, because we did a project 3 years ago on products, and then we developed and started a program for training to do capacity building for installers and so forth. And IRENA basically dropped the ball for 2 years. They're just now starting to pick it back up. And I would like to see if you can just give me some examples of where maybe IRENA's helped in any partnerships here, and also the second entity in terms of the African Development Bank, is there an exemplary project that they've done in partnership through Power Africa program?
Let's see. So I think I'll leave for Lee the ANSI and standards question. We do a lot of work with standards, less so with ARENA, but more with the National Renewable Energy Lab in the U.S., where we've been working with them on standards for microgrids as well as for our off-grid systems and off-grid appliances. I think it's an essential part of the equation, and I think where we see it most importantly is on the power pools and making sure that there's standards as both with the technical side as countries try and integrate their power systems with each other, but also on the financial side that we've worked in the East African Power Pool to set up standard accounting procedures, so to enable the possibility of actual market trade of power. With ARENA, we have worked with them. They are one of the institutions that Power Africa has partnered with. Most recently, we've been working with them on a geothermal risk mitigation facility, trying to figure out ways to buy down a bit of the initial high upfront cost of geothermal development in East Africa. AFDB, I could point to a number of projects. I mean, they're a heavy investor on the continent. I think we have had a large number. Probably the most clear is, I would say, Azura Edo is a large project in Nigeria that I think every multilateral was an investor on. AFDB and World Bank, though, I think are really two essential investors on transmission lines. That they, because it is largely publicly financed at this point, they bring very large dollar amounts to fund transmission lines. It's something we actually hope to work more closely with them on in the future.
I'm just going to step in very briefly to say ANSI has been a tremendous partner with USTDA over the years in Africa and other parts of the world. I'm going to actually tap Brandon for one quick second, because since I've left, I know additional work has been done on standards. Brandon, do you have anything to add about sort of recent, if someone could give that gentleman right there a microphone, one of the phenomenal country managers at USTDA.
Thank you, Lee. I was trying to hide in the back so I wouldn't get called on. So I guess on the standards question, as Lee and the gentleman mentioned, we partner with ANSI on a standards program, which is helping to introduce best practices around standards for clean energy technology to African countries. So we work with ANSI. They're the implementer for the program, which is really focused around sharing best practices and standards for the clean energy sector. We have partnered with ARENA on a workshop. For example, one of the ones we did last year was with ARENA in Kenya, focused on solar standards for solar microgrids. So they're really looking at important things around interconnection issues, pricing model standards. So that's a case where ARENA really helped us to guide who should be in the audience, who should be a part of that program. And again, we were also able to leverage the U.S. private sector. That workshop also included participation by 14 U.S. companies. So really good partnership with ARENA on the standards front as well as ANSI.
Thanks, Brandon. He thought when I left I couldn't call on him anymore.
I want to come back on the AFDB. The initiative works very closely with the African Development Bank. Part of Adesina, the president's high fives. I mean, one of the top is Electrify Africa, I think is what it's called. I'm mixing up the acronyms, but the point is electricity to the continent. But in addition to the money, because the money's there. Money can slide. The private money, we can bring it in. We always keep forgetting about it. That's the catalytic part of the government part. The key, again, it ties to the political will question. The other person that has the equal, if not stronger, political will, muscle in the back room with the heads of state, other than the U.S. Chief of Mission, is the President of the African Development Bank. That trusted African Development Bank is their development bank. To have that discussion, we still have a Mrs. President. These are the things that have to be done to bring in power. We got the money, but you don't do this, the money ain't going to come. That's probably the most important thing the President of Adesina could do.
Hi, Steve Wright, and I'm new to this particular space, but when I was reading about it, there was quite a bit talked about Chinese competition in Africa, and Dr. Yu implied that, the devil's bargain that Africans have to make for Chinese investment. Can I have the panel talk about how that is playing out now? Because I understand the Chinese have become more sophisticated, a little bit less rampant in their efforts to lock into extraction. And how is that going to impact projects and competitiveness for this program in the future?
Great question. Who'd like to start on that?
I'll jump in.
we're still playing catch up in Africa, that China has a very strong presence in Africa. And I think the mantra that we heard so often was, where are the Americans? And there was a real desire for US technology, for US know-how, but the price was right from the Chinese. And so I think that was one of the very important aspects of Power Africa and being able to come together and being able to leverage the private sector, is to be able to get the foothold. I would like to say, because of that, the Chinese may have had to change their practices a little bit, that they just didn't do it on their own, but the fact that they saw that there was real competition and that the US was making a foothold. I think the other thing that was discovered is that a lot of the Chinese technology and infrastructure development just didn't work. It started to fall apart, it was substandard, so the longer they stayed, the more blemishes were seen, and so as a result, they also had to change their tactics a little bit. But it is a very serious competition for US businesses, and I think it's another reason why it's so important that Power Africa exists, is to be able to help US companies, because clearly the Chinese help their companies in ways that we can't even legally. So I think it's been a really important part.
Sure. So I think one of the things that that China did bring to the table is this package solution that brought everything together at once. And I think to some degree that is something we're trying to do with Power Africa, that we bring together the policy agencies, we bring together the money and financing and know-how and all of it. It's not as kind of roped off as maybe the Chinese approach would be, but it is bringing everything together at once. And so we think that that is making it more competitive for anyone who's trying to invest in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's kind of at a high level what I think we're able to do. And I think this is one of the reasons we want to see the Power Africa model expanded, is because it does bring this kind of all the US government resources as well as like-minded partners to the table at once. I think more just a bit in the weeds where we try to work on this is making sure the playing field is leveled. And I think one area where we see this is in procurements, that I think Lee's absolutely right, that there's been some mixed experiences with technology from other sources. And I think we'd love to see procurements being more focused on the sustainability of what's purchased, or the life cycle cost, rather than simply on the upfront costs, because I think that does skew countries to going to what could be cheap technology and is not going to be more cost effective in the long run.
So thank you for bringing up China, because it really matters. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa and you look at if you add up all those countries, what's their number one trading partner? It's China. And we can't have a discussion about development without talking about China, so thank you for bringing it up. Kate used the word sustainability, and that's, I think, what we as the US bring to the table. We're not bringing, some of the Chinese financing is grant, but a lot of it is loans, and they need to be paid back. What we're helping to do with Power Africa is crowd in investment, not loans. And there's a financial, I think sustainability we often think in terms of environment, but it's really a financial term. And what the U.S. brings is financial sustainability to projects, and it's really a really important thing for us to focus on.
Thank you, Newman. Very important point, the financial sustainability, because some of the countries, I mentioned Ghana, you're going to wind up where China alone will have its own HIPIC program. This is what they're driving many of these countries into. But that's a Chinese issue. I think from the standpoint of being able to compete as American firms, you can't have an XIM that can't prove more than 10 million when China XIM and the various arms of China XIM are putting out billions on the continent. So unilateral disarmament doesn't work, is I guess the way I would put it. The other part, I think it's a conundrum. And this is something we need to understand from the political leadership. Now this time I'll back the African political leaders. Many of them are sitting on a ton of coal, okay? The country, many of the southern countries. I'm trying to develop. Okay, you all polluted all this over the hundreds of years. Now I'm trying to come out. What do you want me to do with my coal? Is there clean coal technology? I don't really know the sector. But that's an issue at some point we're going to have to deal with, because if we don't, the Chinese are going to be happy to support it. So how do we deal with that? I'm sorry, I'm being moderator, but it's a question.
No, it is a good. Well, and I do think On the China question in particular, we're seeing a strategic shift right now, which is about evening the playing field internationally vis-a-vis the United States and China on trade. And I think that's interesting because when you look at particular countries or particular instances, right, on particular strategic initiatives, China can be both a competitor and a partner. And I think that it probably is a little bit more nuanced than sort of the headline of the competition, which I think is really, it is important for the U.S. to understand how to make business competitive broadly, but it is also, there are perils to painting China as always just being kind of a nefarious competitor in other places as well. And so I think you're seeing a more colorful story emerge, I think, in countries across the world. Okay, can I see the hands? We got a lot of them, guys. Okay, we're going to go there, and there in that order.
Hi, Rob Sandoli from the U.S. Department of Energy. I'm glad we're having this strategic discussion. And Kate, you asked rhetorically before why we're doing this in the first place, and we've heard a lot of good reasons. And certainly for the long game, it's important to have stable trading partners, as you mentioned. I'm wondering if there's any more focus now on near-term benefits in terms, I think, Nilman, you mentioned 1,000 jobs added, but in terms of jobs and direct U.S. exports from this engagement, do we have more statistics, and is there more focus on delivering on those statistics in the near term? Thanks.
So Kate's team at Power Africa, they have a post on Medium, kind of facts on Power Africa, and they update it every month, and it's this great tracker, so you can see, you know, kind of the continual impact. But so far, just, and measurement's hard because I think that they consistently undercount. They've secured 1,500 U.S. jobs since Power Africa's launch, and the estimate is that by 2030, Power Africa's deal flow could lead to 40,000 U.S. jobs and billions more in exports.
So I'll say, actually, the stat that's on Medium is just from one partner. They've had, since Power Africa launched, about 250 million in exports, which is the 1,500 jobs secured through the U.S. commerce methodology. And I think this is something that we are seeing more of an emphasis on. And it's something that we were already very aware of was happening, but I think that there's a greater emphasis on us making sure that we are driving that as one of our things that we're tracking. And I will say that it's not just these larger companies that are doing large numbers of exports. I think we also want to see this coming from small and medium enterprises as well, that USTDA works with a number of very small businesses where it may be that they added 5 jobs due to Power Africa, but that doubled their workforce. So I think we see that especially from companies that are doing like small-scale microhydro. USTDA has partnered with a number of companies that have worked overseas with that, or with smaller solar home systems or microgrids, where it's a few jobs, but it's a few jobs in places that are really important.
Since folks have already given the USTDA is to focus on exports and to focus on creation of U.S. jobs. But I am going to give another shout out to DOE, because as we are USTDA was reviewing these projects, et cetera, oftentimes we did rely on DOE to help us determine whether this is good technology, how it can be used. So you're a very valuable partner of Power Africa.
I think we should start a tweet storm of everybody's favorite facts about Power Africa's success. So Dan would really like that.
We would welcome that too.
We should start that off. Either the development program, the Africa program, and the energy program. Start tweeting your favorite stats, please. Thank you. Okay, right here, please.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I am a fellow from Uganda, and I really appreciate this session, but I just want to know how Power Africa is engaging the communities, the people that receive the power, the 50% that Mima is talking about, because they're willing to contribute, they're willing to pay for money, for instance, to charge their phone. They pay for batteries, they pay for paraffin, they pay for stuff like that. So how are you engaging those?
You're lucky being from Uganda, because you're from one of the countries with the greatest political will right now, and we have a fantastic partner in your energy minister. I think that in Uganda specifically, we're addressing it from both the grid and off-grid side. We work very closely with UMEME. We have a partnership through the NRECA, which is working on cooperative associations, sorry, to the Rural Electrification Cooperative Association, which takes the US model and helps do electrification in a lot of countries where we work with them. not just in sub-Saharan Africa. So we are trying to improve the grid service through that, working on a lot of national planning in Uganda as well, trying to figure out where we'll likely have grid in the near term and where is more likely to be served by off-grid. And then we work with a number of off-grid companies. There's a lot of our best partners are on the ground in Uganda connecting people to electricity. One of the best ones we've seen recently, I can't say it's a favorite, so maybe one of the many good ones we have working there is Phoenix International. It's a US company based in Uganda, headquartered out of Kampala, and they're packaging together with financing of off-grid systems, using that to establish credit for the households that they can then tap into loans for other things, specifically for education loans. Because I think the point you're getting at is it's not just providing power to people who desperately want it, but it's actually to improving livelihoods in rural areas.
Just real quick, I mean, this is one area, in fact, with IGD, our chairman, Mosbacher, also chairs global communities. So I know there's some programs we're doing actually with USAID, with Power Africa.
Power Africa's most recent partner.
Exactly, where we're looking at the communities actually being, in some sense, the guarantors. It's a little bit like in Pakistan and sort of the community-based banking, where the sort of the enforcement of payment is made by the community themselves, to be sure they get power. Otherwise, they're going to go back to their tigers and cost 50 cents.
Thank you. James Woolley with the Atlantic Council. So we're speaking a bit about, or a lot about off-grid solar as a potential solution and mini-grid solar. However, for that, I feel you're going to need an off-grid savvy and a solar savvy workforce. Are there programs that Power Africa or any other organizations represented involved in that's working on this issue, working with local communities?
I'm going to say yes and no on this, because I think that there's been a big shift in the off-grid systems where it used to be you were putting together and it was a system where you would need someone who knew how that operated pretty well to service it. What we've seen is now almost everything is a very packaged system. One, not very sustainable, because what if it breaks? They need to go back to someone, but also leaving a lot of money on the table in terms of customer interaction. And so they're developed where they have vast, vast sales networks with people out in rural areas, because you're going to buy something from someone you know, most likely. And so they have people who are deep into rural areas who are making commissions on those sales. But then most of the companies we work with now also have large customer service centers. And so they're actually on the phone or through text message interacting with the customer. And this one is great because it makes people more comfortable with what they're buying and makes people feel like they're getting good value from what they're purchasing and using. But it also gives the opportunity to upgrade their system, to sell them new things. And I think that's where we've seen companies that will have, as the loan starts to get paid off, well, we see you're not using your full capacity of your battery. Maybe you want to finance a larger TV. Maybe you want to finance something new. And so I think that's where we're going to see a lot of workforce development, is on the sales and customer service side.
Hi, thank you. Jenny Blair from an organization called PATH, and we work in the global health space. And I'm actually here curious, we've been doing quite a bit of thinking about a Power Africa type model for health innovation, to work with local innovators and local entrepreneurs as they work to develop and scale new products. And thinking about the model and really the strength of bringing together folks from all different sectors, private sector, public sector, small companies, big companies. Curious, what about the model helped overcome some of the common barriers to partnership and create strong partnerships that have been impactful?
Any thoughts on that? You force everyone to sit in a room. No, I'm just kidding.
I think that what's nice about having a goal is that everyone can then focus on how do you achieve the goal, rather than coming to a meeting to talk about an issue, right? So if we're going to have a meeting on Africa energy, then I'm going to come to represent my interests of my company or my agency or whatever. And if you're coming of how do we increase energy access in this particular region or improve health outcomes on this type of topic, and you come with a different point of view. So I like the idea of having this unity of purpose rather than coordination meetings, because you come with a goal, and then if you tee up people to talk about what is their contribution to achieving that goal, you cut down kind of some of the turf wars.
I think that's actually a really good point, though, because what I've noticed in what everyone has sort of been saying is your goal can evolve over time. But if you start with one, it does help orient everybody in a certain direction. Okay, sir, yes, please. If you want to, you have time. Sure. Okay, please, Richard.
Richard Smith with Chemonics. I just want to ask, how can you leverage the brand equity that you've created in Power Africa? And also, how are you thinking to sort of zoom out from this focus that you've had on transactions to look at some of the more long-term challenges that there are to growing the energy sector in sub-Saharan Africa? And I want to give you two examples of what I mean. One is from Liberia, where for a long, long time you had LEC with its 22 megawatt installed capacity, 17 megawatts functioning, selling power at over 50 cents per kilowatt hour. And yet they were unable to increase power generation or expand their networks. Now they face the challenge because, as has been said, Mount Coffee is now going to provide very, very shortly 88 megawatts. And yet you do not have the distribution networks to take up that excess power. Similar example, I've done a lot of work in Pakistan. I started in the 80s. The problem was load shedding. There was a 1,500 megawatt shortfall. Pakistan thought they had the solution. They opened up and introduced private power through IPPs. They went very quickly from a 1,500 megawatt shortfall to a 500 megawatt surplus without having a plan to evacuate that power. The government's response was what? To default on all the PPAs that they signed with the private sector. 10 plus years later, arbitration, the government ends up having to pay those independent power producers for the default. So how can you now, or what's your plan to zoom back, look back, because you will see more and more of these examples as more infrastructure comes along. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we covered this a little bit earlier, Kate, but please, if you want to give it another.
Sure. So I think I'll take the zooming back out. I do want to make the distinction between what Power Africa focused on talking about, which was largely the megawatts and connections, and what we actually did. And so I think Liberia is a great example where for several years we've been working very closely with the Rural and Renewable Energy Agency, partnering with NRECA, which I mentioned previously, on the rural electrification planning, trying to figure out how to build out that distribution network, as well as working closely with World Bank and others to make sure that there's another management contract in place for LEC and make sure that the electric company is able to make those connections as well. So even though that's not always the first thing we talk about, it is work that is happening in the background because we are very cognizant that they need to build out the network, not only to have a place for the power from Mount Coffee to go, but also because they have a dreadfully low access rate in Liberia right now. Same thing with the IPP's case in Pakistan. This is something that I think a number of countries are very, very aware of right now and have actually stopped short before getting into that position. So we've seen countries that did have a very large pipeline of IPPs coming up start to slow down their progress on that with the recognition that the transmission lines aren't built. That is something that, again, we've been working on for several years in both East and West Africa on the power pools and on laying the groundwork for greater power trade. I think it's something we see ourselves needing to engage much more directly on in the future, simply because the pace of growth in the transmission system has not been fast enough to absorb that power.
Very quickly, LEC happens to be very close. Buchanan Renewables was in Liberia, and the whole issue was exactly that. We proposed an issue 27 megas, and they said, well, we can't move but 12. But the underlying point, I think, important point of your question is, the focus on the utilities, because it's utilities in the middle that are finally between the generators and the customer. And that's where we have a disastrous space. Just yesterday, I think, for one of these stages, President Ouattara, Cote d'Ivoire, saying, why does Cote d'Ivoire have tenth of the population of Nigeria, half of the power production will soon be equal because they have a utility that operates. And I think we forget the importance of that. I don't know how we can really get back into that, to assist the build of a utility. I think that key element in the middle. Thank you.
We have almost reached our time. This has been a really fun conversation. I want to ask each of you to do one thing for me. If you could, with the recognition that a lot of the reason why we're having this discussion is that it's important to focus on the success of Power Africa, but that there is an ask out there for policymakers to sustain, strengthen, and possibly expand this program. What is the largest strategic driver for the United States for doing that? And you have to kind of pick one. If you're creative about your phrasing, you can get more than one in there, but if we could go down the line and just give me your bumper sticker on that. The largest strategic driver for continued U.S. support for Power Africa?
It works.
I give that a thank.
And the one thing I would say, it's very difficult when one comes into a new position to not want to try to change everything. But true leadership means that you recognize when something is working, and you don't necessarily have to change it. And there's a lot going on out there of people trying to move around boxes and trying to put their brand on it. Power Africa works. This model of development works. Let the agencies do their job, not focus on defending their existence.
I'll answer it by saying where I think Power Africa will be eventually. And I will say I think eventually we should not exist. We should have created an environment where there is universal access to electricity, where there's sufficient generation to drive economic growth and power industry, and where Africa is a place where there is economic opportunity and a fantastic trading partner with the United States. I think that's the end goal for any development, is that that's the state that you reach. I think for Power Africa to achieve that, though, the next several years are really, really critical. Because when we're looking at a program where we're trying to transform the market and drive in private sector investment, if we fall off of that too early, we're going to be right back where we started. That we're really laying the foundation through mitigating the risk for private sector, through working with governments to create the right environment where that investment can come in. And it's really critical that we continue to pull all those tools together. I think both for making it so it's an attractive environment for anyone, but specifically for U.S. investment. We work with a lot of U.S. companies that are motivated about investing in Africa, and we want to continue to provide that support.
I would argue that part of sustaining the greatness of our country is our economic health. 95% of the world's consumers are outside our borders. There's a massively growing population of consumers in Africa. We want to sell to them. We can't connect to them without electricity. They can't learn about our products, they can't buy our products, they can't trade with us unless there's electricity. And we need to focus on electricity because it's a fundamental pivot or foundation for their growth and development. It's important for humanitarian reasons. It's important for economic development. It's also important for national security. When people don't have access to electricity and they are not able to benefit from the modern economy, they can turn to alternative ideologies that don't serve American interests. So I think that focusing on power that can raise up a continent that really matters to the United States is really important.
I think I know we're on the same advisory council. 1 billion new mouths are coming forward in Africa, right? No jobs, no electricity, no jobs. No jobs, the place blows up. Trying to treat insecurity rather than prevent it is costlier. That's why you do Power Africa.
Great. Mima, Nilmani, Kate, Lee, thank you so much for your contributions today, and thanks to the development program, Dan Shop, Errol, everybody, and Jennifer, Cook Shop in Africa here as well. It's our pleasure to host these events, and we thank you for all the good work that you guys are doing and wish you all the best. So thank you very much.